Good day, everyone. I am Hannah Y. Barot, and today I'm going to talk about designing qualitative research, which will be focused mainly on developing research questions and conceptual frameworks. So, what is a qualitative research question? A qualitative research question is an open ended inquiry designed to explore, discover, and understand the depth and nuances of human experiences, perceptions, motivations, and behaviors rather than to quantify them. So, quality research questions are critical to provide accurate research and findings in a qualitative research. Choosing the appropriate research questions drives both the method and findings of the research. So, how can you develop research questions? In a qualitative study, researchers state research questions, not objectives or hypotheses. These research questions assume two forms. One is a central question, and the other one is associated sub questions. So, here are the guidelines for writing qualitative research questions. First is ask one or two central research questions. The central research question is a broad question that asks for an exploration of the central phenomenon or concept in a study. So you might want to ask yourself, what is the broadest question that I can ask in the study? For example, you have the topic on teacher motivation and retention. So, the central research question might be, what are the key factors that motivate and demotivate experienced teachers to remain in the profession? Next is the second one is that several sub questions follow each general question. They narrow the focus of the study but leave open the questioning. So, questions in qualitative research can be described as an inverted pyramid, beginning with a broad, overarching question and narrowing down to focus on the why and how of the specific phenomenon. So here are examples. Central or overarching question is, how do experienced teachers perceive the effectiveness of current professional development programs? So your sub questions might be, what professional development opportunities do teachers value most and why? How do they describe the barriers and facilitators to apply new knowledge or skills in the classroom? And in what ways do teachers feel their individual needs and expertise are addressed through existing programs? And how do they describe the role of collaboration with colleagues in their ongoing professional growth? The sub-questions in turn become specific questions used during interviews or in observing or when looking at documents. Next guideline is relate the central question to the specific qualitative strategy of inquiry. For example, the specificity of the questions in ethnography at this stage of the design differs from that in other qualitative strategies. So, if you're doing a phenomenological study, your questions might be open ended in order to allow participants to share their experiences in their own words. If you're doing a grounded theory, your questions might be focused on generating a list of categories or themes. If you're doing ethnography, your questions might be about understanding the culture you're studying. Fourth guideline is to use exploratory verbs that convey the language of emerging design. These verbs tell the reader that the study will do the following: describe the essence of the experience in phenomenology, discover in grounded theory, seek to understand in ethnography, explore a process in a case study. So your questions should be clear, concise, and understandable to those outside of your field. In addition, they should generate rich data. The questions you choose will also depend on the type of research you are doing. We'll have more examples in crafting your research questions. But first, let's have the key characteristics of a qualitative research question. One is exploratory and open ended. They are not limited to simple yes no answers. Instead, they use words like what, how, and describe to invite detailed, in depth responses. Next is focus on lived experience. Qualitative questions center on personal experiences, perceptions, feelings, and the meanings people attach to their lives. Next, context specific. They often focus on a specific group of people in a particular setting to gain a deep understanding of a localized situation. Next, guides the study. So, a qualitative research question defines the scope and focus of the study, guiding the researcher's approach to data collection and analysis. Last is flexible and emergent. Unlike in quantitative research, qualitative research questions can be refined or changed during the course of the study as the researcher's understanding of the topic deepens. Now let's have the sample script. Here is a typical script for a qualitative central question. So, this sample script can serve as your guide in crafting your research questions. Now, we'll have an example. This is a qualitative central question from a phenomenology research. How do high school student leaders perceive their influence on the overall school culture and their peers' engagement? So this question starts with how, uses the open ended verb perceive, and focuses on the single concept of student leaders' influence within the specific group of high school student leaders. Next one is a question, research question from a case study. How do student mentors describe their experiences and challenges in a newly implemented high school peer mentorship program? So this question starts with how, uses the open ended verb describe, and focuses on a single concept, the experiences and challenges of a specific group of participants, which is the student mentors, within a specific program, which is the peer mentorship program. We're done with research questions. Now let's move on to conceptual framework. What is a conceptual framework? A conceptual framework in a qualitative study is a visual or written model that outlines the main concepts of your research and how they relate to each other. It helps to organize your thoughts, provide a structure for your study, and explain the theoretical foundations of your work. Unlike a quantitative study, a qualitative conceptual framework is often less rigid and can evolve as the research progresses. Now, how can you develop a conceptual framework? So, number one is begin with your research questions. What are you trying to find out? What problem or issue are you studying? So, for example, your research question is: how do female college students describe their experiences with anxiety and academic pressure, and what coping strategies do they use? So, this question is your starting point. Your conceptual framework needs to connect with your questions. Step 2: conduct a literature review. Search for and analyze scholarly articles, theories, and models used by other researchers to discuss your topic. So, you need to do a targeted literature review. Look for the theories, concepts, and models that other researchers have used to talk about your topic. This is the example. So, if your research question is, how do female college students describe their experiences with anxiety and academic pressure, and what coping strategies do they use? So you might come across with these theories, concepts, and models. First is self-efficacy theory by Albert Bandura. Next is stress and coping model by Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman, and social cognitive theory by Albert Bandura. So these are the theories and models that you might come across if this is your research question. Now, you don't need to include all the theories and concepts and models that you found out. You just need to include the main ones that fit your research focus. Okay, now for step 3, identify key concepts and variables. So, from the literature review, pinpoint the central ideas, constructs, and variables that are essential to your study. So, what are the key concepts and variables in my study? So, you need to pick out the main ideas that are going to be helpful to explain what is going on in your study. You need to take a look at the literature and identify the key concepts. For example, in our research question, how do female college students describe their experiences with anxiety and academic pressure, and what coping strategies do they use? So, these are some of the variables and key concepts that you might come across: academic environment, social and cultural expectations, self perception, and external support systems. Now, let's have step 4. Map relationships among concepts. Determine how these identified concepts and variables connect and relate to each other within your study. Show how those concepts connect to each other. Once you've chosen the key theories, the key ideas, the concepts, the issues, you need to take a look: how do they connect? How do they fit together? You need to give your reader a clear picture of how do these things guide your research. Step 5, define your concepts. Provide clear definitions for each construct, explaining what each concept means in the specific context of your research. Why did I include this theory or concept? Is it relevant to my study? So, here is an example of how are you going to define your concepts. Self-efficacy theory is helpful to this study because it explains how students' belief in their ability to manage academic demands can influence both the intensity of their anxiety and their coping strategies. Stress and coping model is relevant to this study because this model provides a framework to understand how female college students appraise academic pressure. Social cognitive theory is helpful to this study because it explains how people learn through observing others and how their beliefs, behaviors, and environment interact. So explain why are you using all of these things. You need to show how you made thoughtful and informed choices why you include this in your study. Now, what does a qualitative conceptual framework look like? So, there are three ways to show your conceptual framework. First is through a diagram, second is a written explanation, and third is a table. So, this part is really up to you. It depends on your style, on your preference, but the most commonly used is diagram. So here is an example of a conceptual framework in a diagram form. You can also have this one in a paragraph form. Next is a table. So in a table, you have there in the first column the concept or theory. Next column is the application to study, and the last column is linked to questions or methods. I think that would be all. Thank you so much for listening.